Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into the cinematic history of a massive 90s phenomenon. We are going to look at how a 1995 martial arts fantasy literally defied all the odds to become the undisputed gold standard for video game adaptations. I'm talking, of course, about Mortal Kombat. Now, back in the early 90s, if you asked anyone in Hollywood if a video game movie could actually be good, the answer was a flat-out no. I mean, today, we're treated to these prestige, critically acclaimed shows like The Last of Us, right? So it's kind of hard to imagine just how dire the landscape was for gamers in 1995. The video game movie curse was a very real thing, and the track record was honestly dismal. Even the executives at Midway Games, the actual publisher of the arcade cabinet, severely doubted this film could succeed. They just didn't think their hyper-violent tournament fighter could translate to the big screen. But against all odds, a small, scrappy group of filmmakers were determined to prove them wrong.
Which brings us to part 1, the video game movie curse. Defying this curse started with visionary producer Lawrence Kasanoff. He looked at a quarter-eating arcade machine and basically saw cinematic gold. But getting the rights, that was an absolute uphill battle. Kasanoff had to endure months of relentless negotiation to finally convince Midway. And once he had the rights in hand, he hired director Paul Anderson. Now get this, Anderson had only directed one film prior to this, and he had zero, and I mean zero, experience with visual effects. But he was just so pumped about the project that he went out, bought every book he could find on VFX, and literally bluffed his way into the job. He completely faked it until he made it to bring this fantasy world to life.
All right, let's move on to part 2, choosing your fighters. So finding a director was really only half the battle, right? They needed a cast, and the casting process was, well, remarkably chaotic. At first, Hollywood heavyweights circled the project, but ultimately passed. For example, Sean Connery turned down the role of Lord Raiden simply because he didn't want a physically demanding shoot. Jean-Claude Van Damme was offered Johnny Cage, but he passed so he could go do the Street Fighter movie instead. Oh, and Cameron Diaz was actually cast as Sonya Blade, but she had to drop out at the last minute because of a wrist injury. But all of this paved the way for the final roster, a group of relatively unknown actors, including Christopher Lambert, Bridget Wilson, and Lyndon Ashby. And let me tell you, they fully committed to this tournament. Actually, the behind-the-scenes trivia for this cast is just wild. Take Cary Hiroyuki Tagawa. He was the first and only choice for the villain Shang Tsung. Why? Because he showed up to his audition in full costume, stood on a chair, and read his lines commanding the entire room. Unbelievable. Then there's Robin Shao, who played our lead hero Liu Kang. He initially wanted to turn down the role because he just assumed he'd be cast as a stereotypical Asian villain. It wasn't until his agent was like, "No, you're the lead hero," that he finally accepted. And Bridget Wilson, she literally flew out to the set the very morning after wrapping up her role in the Adam Sandler comedy Billy Madison to step in and replace Cameron Diaz. Talk about a crazy pivot.
This leads us into part 3, surviving the shoot.
And survive is definitely the right word because the production itself turned into a brutal, intensely physical battle. They were shooting on location in remote Thailand, getting to the sets on these long canoe-style boats, and since the actors performed most of their own stunts, the injury list got pretty extensive. Lyndon Ashby suffered a bruised kidney while fighting Scorpion. Bridget Wilson completely dislocated her shoulder, had it popped right back in, and just kept filming. And Robin Shao? He literally fractured 2 ribs after being thrown into a pillar during his fight with Reptile. But here's the crazy part. He hid the injury from the director. He only told his co-star to please avoid hitting him on the right side, all just to keep the production from shutting down. I mean, that is some serious dedication. And then there was the reigning Mortal Kombat champion himself, Goro. It cost a staggering $1 million to build the incredibly elaborate animatronic puppet of this 4-armed beast. That is a massive chunk of change for a puppet. But despite its massive cost, this practical effect was an absolute nightmare on set. Goro was just constantly malfunctioning, requiring anywhere up to 16 puppeteers to operate at once. And worse, the poor person stationed inside the suit could only stay in there for 2 minutes at a time because they would literally run out of oxygen. Because of this, the director actually had to drastically reduce Goro's screen time just to work around these massive, exhausting limitations.
Okay, let's jump to part 4, scoring a flawless victory.
So, the biggest hurdle they had left was the MPAA rating. The video game, as we all know, is famous for its R-rated gore and brutal fatalities. But the studio absolutely needed a PG-13 rating to hit their target demographic. So how do you do that without losing the edge? Well, they talked to the ratings board and discovered a brilliant loophole.
The PG-13 rating forbids on-screen death for human characters. So the crew creatively navigated this by making sure that all the gruesome explosive fatalities happened exclusively to the non-human monsters. If it's a demon or a lizard, hey, it's fair game. And then, of course, there's the music. To match the insane, high-energy gameplay, composer George S. Clinton completely scrapped traditional action music. He called his new creation a techno-taiko orcho, or as he put it, a testosterone orchestra. He intentionally removed high-pitched treble instruments like flutes and violins, and instead relied entirely on heavy brass, massive percussion, and deep pounding bass. When you pair that with the intense guitar work from Buckethead and that iconic techno theme song, it's no surprise the soundtrack went platinum in less than a year.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, A Cult Classic Legacy. So after all the broken ribs, the broken animatronics, and the massive creative gambles, these underdog filmmakers had to face the most ruthless opponents of all, the box office and the critics. And remember, they were working with a very modest $20 million budget. By Hollywood standards, especially for a special effects-heavy fantasy film trying to build an entirely otherworldly dimension, that is a remarkably tight constraint. But against all odds, they scored a flawless victory. That $20 million budget was absolutely dwarfed by a massive $122.2 million worldwide gross. To put that in perspective, the film spent 3 consecutive weeks at #1 in the US, easily becoming the highest-grossing video game adaptation of its time. The fans absolutely showed up for this one. Now, the reception was incredibly divided. Traditional film critics largely dismissed it, which gave it a 43% on Rotten Tomatoes. Reviewers at the time were calling it empty-headed and mythological junk food. Ouch. But the passionate fan base, they awarded it a rare A- cinema score. This really proves that the filmmakers succeeded in their exact mission. They delivered a movie that captured the essence, the speed, and the pure fun that the actual players wanted to see.
And decades later, history has definitely sided with the fans. Mortal Kombat is hailed today as an ambitious, perfectly cast martial arts cult classic. It walked this razor-thin line, perfectly balancing a real reverence for the source material with some undeniable, glorious 90s goofiness. Standout performances like Kari Hiroyuki Tagawa's definitive portrayal of Shang Tsung are still celebrated today. In fact, his performance was so iconic that the actual video game franchise eventually brought him back to voice the character decades later. It truly remains a highly rewatchable lightning-in-a-bottle triumph.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Looking back at this absolute victory against the video game movie curse, it really leaves us wondering, in our modern era of super-polished, massive CGI blockbusters, could a chaotic, physically brutal, practical effects-driven passion project like this ever successfully define a genre again? Or was Mortal Kombat just a perfect, unrepeatable spark of 90s magic? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.